Hey, welcome to the Christ Revealed YouTube channel. I got a great interview coming up for you. Really great to be here with you. Enjoy this interview. It's compelling. I mean, it's not like a leap of logic that if you can pretty much corroborate that, that at least a handful of them, you can see they did die as martyrs, then it's not unreasonable to suggest that the other ones could have also.
Yeah, I think the key is to argue this. You look in the book of Acts, chapter 4 and 5, the apostles start proclaiming the risen Jesus. Right. They're threatened, they're beaten, they're thrown in prison. We see Stephen killed in the early chapters of Acts. We see James killed in Acts 12 too. And they're told, just stop proclaiming the risen Jesus. In Acts 5, Paul basically says we can't. We fear God more than we fear men. So the earliest record we have is this group of men proclaiming they'd seen the risen Jesus, willing to suffer and die and face persecution for that belief. We have no record any of them recanted, and we know with confidence that at least some of them died as martyrs. Right. So this doesn't prove the resurrection is true, but it tells us they didn't make it up. They were sincere. They didn't invent this false story to get themselves persecuted and to lose everything. They really believed Jesus had risen from the grave and appeared to them.
So with that now, it's a great area of focus to say, let's go deep here and see what does exist in the way of information around this and evidence. What other things about the resurrection do you feel like is very compelling as far as saying that the resurrection is validated?
Well, I think we have to go step by step and look at the facts that we know. So sometimes people start and say, we've got to defend the entire Bible being true, and then you get the resurrection thrown in. Right. Well, I think we can make a case from archaeology, from manuscripts, etc., that the Bible and the New Testament and the Gospels are reliable documents. But we can also say, let's just look at this event, the resurrection, through the lens of how we would look at any event in history. See what facts we know are true, and ask what conclusion best explains it. So there's a few things we know. Did Jesus die? Well, that's unmistakable. We have medical evidence that blood and water came out, that John reports, which only happened, we can medically show at the point of death. We have it multiple attestation in all the Gospels, the writings of Paul, writings of Peter. We even have Josephus and Tacitus, extra biblical writers talking about Jesus dying. So Jesus died on the cross. But then we have this amazing evidence for an empty tomb. One piece of fact being that it was discovered by women. I find this very fascinating. If you're the apostles and you're making up in that culture a story based on a resurrection in which a woman's testimony was not valued as highly as a man's testimony. In fact, the more significant an event was, the less likely they would rely upon a woman. So you're the apostles, and you're inventing a story based upon a historical event. Who's the least likely people you would invent? Well, it's obvious, women. Right. So why do they all report, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that women found the tomb? Because that's what they really believed happened. They weren't inventing this story. Then you have all these cases of appearances. You have appearances to the 500 in 1 Corinthians 15. You have appearances to the apostles. You have appearances again to the women. You have appearances to skeptics like Thomas, James, and Paul. And then you have this transformation of the apostles, willing to suffer and die for this. Tells me they didn't make this up. We have good, consistent early evidence that Jesus rose from the grave. Now, other people might say, okay, here's other theories that can explain the resurrection. Right. And you just Google this, you'll find endless hypotheses. But the question always has to be, given certain facts that we know, what theory best explains all of them and has the least problems? So probably the most common one is that the apostles hallucinated. Well, one big problem with that is hallucinations are internal subjective feelings. There's not an external object that matches up with them. Well, we have multiple accounts of group appearances of Jesus. I mean, you can no more share hallucination than you can a dream. So hallucinations have a hard time accounting for the facts. It also can't really account for the empty tomb. Another common one, which really rocked me in high school, I grew up in a Christian home, and I heard that the Bible is true. I always believed it. And then I heard these skeptics who wrote these articles that said maybe Jesus didn't exist. Maybe Christianity is patterned after these dying and rising gods, Mithras and Horus and Adonis and Isis from, kind of the ancient world at that time. And there's nothing unique about Christianity. I'd never heard that before. And it rocked me intellectually and emotionally to think, what if the story isn't true? When I started to look into it, I realized that there's a few huge problems with this. Number one, the dating is all wrong. So some of these stories existed before the time of Christ, but any of the parts of the stories that closely mirror Christianity tend to come from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. So if there's any borrowing going on, it's from them borrowing from Christianity rather than the other way around. Second, you'll see similar terms, but what they mean by these terms are very different. So last time I looked, it's been a little while, on Wikipedia, it said that Osiris resurrected. Well, that sounds like Jesus resurrected, Osiris resurrected. Well, if you read the story of Osiris, he's murdered, thrown into a chest, falls in the bottom of the sea, body is put back together, and eventually becomes god of the underworld. That's not a resurrection. It's the same word, but it doesn't have the same meaning. Besides, these are fictional stories that are patterned after the dying and rising of the seasons, not historical events like we have with the person of Jesus. There's many other naturalistic hypotheses that people put in, but none of them can account for the facts that we know with as much consistency and power as the resurrection.
So what do you think right now is the biggest, or some of the bigger misconceptions about Christianity, that non-Christians or the non-Christian world has a certain view of Christianity from the outside, looking from the outside in as compared to from the inside out? What do you think is some of the mischaracterizations that are erroneous?
I think of a few. I think, number one, people look at it and say, well, look at all the bloodshed and the horror and atrocities done in the name of Christ. That's a common misconception. Now, certainly some bad things have been done by people who say that they are believers and by the church. I'm not denying that, but that's the lens by which people see all of Christianity. They miss, number one, all the good that's been done in the name of Christ: hospitals, universities, orphanages, women's rights, etc. And people also fail to distinguish between when people do things that goes against what Jesus taught. Clearly they're violating the way Jesus told people to live. So I do think a lot of people look at Christianity through that lens, which I don't think is the whole picture. I think another one, people look at Christianity and just think, as with any religion, it's all a matter of faith. It's just blind faith. Just believe it if it works for you. And they don't realize that Christianity is based upon a testable historical event. I think the other one is, a first question in many people's minds today is not so much, is Christianity true, but is Christianity good? I think we live in a culture, given certain moral norms that have been broadly accepted, in particular related to the issue of sexuality. Christians are bigoted, they're hateful, they're intolerant. So many people won't even consider the evidence because they look at Christians, or at least the perception of Christians that's proclaimed to them, and they think, why would I want to be like that? So they don't even entertain the evidence.
Right.
Those are three big pushbacks that I tend to see.
And do you feel like they many times are building straw men? There's a bad apple who's proclaimed to be a Christian, but doesn't practice the moral code of Christianity, if you will, but then say, they're held out as the poster child in the media as a straw man, basically, to discredit Christianity.
I do think that happens. A few years ago, I wrote this book answering some of the big objections that the new atheists at this time were raising against Christianity. So I called up one of the largest skeptical groups where I live in Southern California, and I said, hey, I'd be willing to come to your group. I'll give you all a free book and just sit in the hot seat, and you can ask me whatever questions you'd like to ask a Christian. I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers, but maybe we could have a conversation. So I went up there with my pastor and my wife in this home. There were about 20 skeptics, atheists, agnostics that were there, and we had a wonderful conversation. And one thing that stood out to me was how many misconceptions they had about Christians because of a TV show that they saw, because of a comment they heard, because of a classmate. These isolated individual experiences shaped how they saw all of Christians. And one reason was a lot of them didn't know a Christian. Now, in fairness, Christians can do the same thing to other groups. They maybe don't know a Muslim, maybe don't know an atheist. So they have a misconception and see them entirely through that lens. So that's why it's important, whoever's watching this, to say, you know what, let's ask, is my perception of this group, whoever it is, accurate? Do I know people in this group? Do I take the time to listen to them and accurately understand what they believe and why they believe it? So I think you're absolutely right. A lot of people reject a straw man of Christianity, not what Christianity really believes and what Jesus really taught.
Now, this is fascinating to me because I think that is a misconception in and of itself. You've now mentioned it twice with your students and now with yourself, saying that there's a local group of atheists. And I don't think most people would say, well, listen, I'm a Christian, I teach in this arena. Let's have a conversation, right? Most people would say, I don't want to know those people, or they feel like there'd be some kind of a condescending judgment against these people who are non-Christians and maybe even are trying to discredit Christianity. But instead, you want to show up and actually have the conversation. What was their disposition towards you?
You know what? When I sat down and it started, the head of the group, who's become a friend of mine, he looked at me and he goes, kudos to you. And I said, why? He goes, I can't believe you'd have the guts to just come and sit here in our group and be a part of this. Not many Christians would do this. Now, sadly, he's right. And I'm not saying that to give myself a pat on the back, but most people are not willing to step outside of their comfort zone to meet people. It's easier to label. It's easier to throw bombs on social media from a distance. I had a chance to preach in a mosque about 4 weeks ago. And the imam and I had a conversation. We disagreed, but it was cordial. He was so gracious. They served the best food, Middle Eastern food you could imagine.
Right.
And we clarified. I think most people today, if you treat them with respect and you see them in person, not just online, are willing to have conversations about faith. I really do.
That's it for this particular interview. Thanks for joining me. Really excited to take this ongoing journey with you as we keep bringing more content. If you haven't already, you really should subscribe to this channel. There's a lot of phenomenal content coming down the road into the future that you'll want to know about. Leave a comment down here. I think people would love to hear from you, and then you can hear from them too. If you liked it, go ahead and give a like. It only takes half a second, and share this with people that you care about. The world needs more light in it right now. So thanks for being with me. Hope to connect with you again soon.